Okay, we're now recording and we're all set, Colin.
Welcome, everybody. I am your host and step in chair for tonight due to some unforeseen circumstances. So I think we're going to start the meeting off tonight with a review on 250 Water Street and the Brownfield Cleanup Program with Laura Dodge, who I'm informed is here and ready to go. Is that right, Diana?
Hi, Laura. I see you. Are you ready to go? You may be muted. Let me get in and unmute you. Hi, Laura. Are you there?
She's muted.
Okay.
I think we've got it. Hi, Laura.
Hi, how are you? How are you?
Welcome. Thank you for being here tonight.
So, absolutely. Thank you for asking me. So where we stand now is, I think we reported the last time that the field investigation, all 5 phases that were scheduled are completed. All of the soil gas, groundwater analytical results have been received by Langen, provided to the DEC and the DOH. They then provided them to myself and Tom Pasillo, the consultant for the Blue School. We've had at least 2 meetings or virtual meetings, conference calls regarding the soil analytical results, which were the last, and the groundwater analytical results, I'm sorry, the last batch of data that came in. And there's a tremendous amount of information. So the last phase of the data review has been to try to take everything that's been generated to date, all of the original geophysical results, the soil vapor results, the soil analytical results from the thermometer factory footprint, from the historic fill, from the former underground storage tanks. And then on top of that, the groundwater analytical results, groundwater level measurements, and then try to put it all together and evaluate whether or not the site has been fully investigated with respect to all the different media. So the call we had with DEC and DOH last Thursday, we discussed the fact that the agencies are still working their way through all of the results because there are so many data points that came in after the last several rounds of investigation. We provided our insight as to what we thought the data indicated and how it looked. We talked about having difficulty sort of synthesizing all the results because there are so many data points and trying to make it more user-friendly for everybody to get through and sort of process. So I think the agencies are requesting some additional figures from Langen and HHC to try to help with that process so that it'll be a little clearer as to whether everything has been defined satisfactorily to the point where a conclusion can be made regarding whether the RI is in fact complete for all media, meaning for soil, for vapor, for groundwater. And they don't know exactly how long that process will take at this point. I think they've made some requests and some new requests, perhaps last week or possibly today. And so I'm not 100% sure how long the process will continue to take because Langen will need to speak to HHC and come back with the requested information or with a response regarding, their take on the request. But we're getting close to having a determination as to whether or not there needs to be any additional investigation at this point, or whether conclusions can be drawn sufficiently so that the RI can be deemed complete and a proposal for the next phase of work, which would be the remediation, and a remedial action work plan can be designed. So that is essentially where we are. There were 3 days of geotechnical testing that were done in October. I believe it was the 10th, 11th, and 12th. That was a Saturday, Sunday, Monday. outside of school hours. The community air monitoring plan that was developed as part of the remedial investigation work plan was implemented, and there were no air quality issues of any kind. That data is being used for purposes of evaluating building foundation design parameters for the, related to the proposed redevelopment. And those data, those daily field reports were posted on the project website, which is one thing that we had asked of the agencies to ensure that that was the case. And I think they already had gone ahead and realized that that was something that they wanted to do, and they did do that. Again, no issues with respect to air quality. So the only other piece, I guess, is that we talked about, whether or not there needed to be any test pit work done, because that is part of what's mentioned in the revised remedial investigation work plan, is whether any of the results from the first 5 phases of investigation suggest the need to do any additional subsurface investigation of any kind, whether there needs to be any additional soil samples collected or subsurface investigation to determine the cause of refusal, for instance, of any of the soil borings. And that discussion we had with the agencies, and they're taking our, comments into consideration. And our perspective is really one of understanding what the implications of the RI data would have on what a remediation and redevelopment scope would entail, and how you would correlate the air quality data from the RI to what would be necessary or appropriate during a remediation that would then transition into a redevelopment. So the comments we had sort of centered around, that dialogue. And so the agencies are, they took our comments and thoughts, and then they're going to be circled back with Langen and HHC. So again, it's not clear whether the timeline will be a few weeks or maybe a little longer, because there are just so many data points to evaluate. But that's basically where we stand.
Great, thank you. What's the timeline on that, by the way? The next stage.
Yeah, as I said, it's I'm not 100% sure, Colin, if it's going to be a matter of weeks or possibly a little longer, because the DEC and DOH have to have the discussion with Langen and HHC. Then they have to respond back with whatever it is that they feel is responsive to the request for a little bit of additional work to sort of help visualize the results. When you have so many data points like that were collected here, it's sometimes difficult to visualize what these data really are indicating. And I think it would be helpful to have some more visual representations of that, so that everybody, the professionals, the agencies, and the public could get a better idea of what the results show.
Understood. Diane, I see a lot of people are on the phone, so I would imagine a lot of them are related to this, but let's start with the board members. Do we have any questions from any of the CB1 board members? I see no hands. There's got to be something.
Yes, hands.
Use your hands, guys. I can't believe there's a single question. There you go.
I got a question. Hi, it's Richard Corman. Laura, thanks for that. I wasn't clear from what you said. Did you draw any preliminary conclusions from the data that you shared with them, or is it too premature?
Well, I think, Richard, it's a good question. We did conclude that vertical delineation, defining the depth of impacts in soil, was largely complete. There were only 3 borings where they hit refusal vertically. And in each of those instances, it appeared to be some type of timber. But everywhere else, they were able to get vertical delineation of the extent of any soil impacts. So that process, I believe, has been largely complete. Laterally, it's a little bit more difficult, because the number of samples they took in the vertical profile, and then going out laterally from, let's say, the thermometer factory area. Some of the samples were collected at different depth intervals. So you have to look at whether or not laterally, horizontally, going out from the area of the former thermometer factory footprint itself, whether delineation can be deemed complete is a professional judgment that we relayed our thoughts to the agencies, and they're taking those thoughts, and that's one of the reasons why they're asking for some additional graphics to help sort of visualize how Langen is interpreting achieving lateral delineation. And there's a lot, mercury is the primary driver for that, because there are a few other constituents that need to be discussed, but those are not related necessarily to operational history, more to historic fill, likely.
Thanks. Let me just follow up with that. Does your contract extend to the evaluation of the next phase when the assessment comes out from DEC and DOH?
Yeah, our work scope goes through the issuance of the draft remedial investigation report, which will be the document that will be generated after this. And then also the final remedial investigation report, which we obviously would just review to ensure that the draft changes were reflected as anticipated. So that process will be similar to what we did with the remedial investigation work plan, where we reviewed a draft, provided comments, and had discussions with Langen and HHC, and then the agencies. And then the agencies would decide what they wanted to require of Langen or HHC. And then after that document is issued is the end of our scope of work right now, our authorized scope of work.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Appreciate it.
Yep, absolutely.
Michael Kramer, you were next.
Hi, Laura. Two questions. One question is about that remediation plan. Could you just give us a range of best case, worst case of when that would be finalized?
Difficult for me to say right now, Michael, because I'm not 100% sure what the timeline is for Langen's anticipated issuance of the draft and final RI, but generally speaking, I would say best case for a draft RI might be within a month and a half, and worst case, it could take longer, perhaps another 2 months. But again, I'm really didn't get into that discussion with the agencies, so that's just my best estimate. It really is more of an update that Langen will have to provide once their discussions with DEC and DOH are over, because I think those discussions are still going on. So I think, I believe, because they already did do the geotechnical investigation, that their intent would be to try to get the RI draft, wrapped up sooner than later. It is a lot of work to reduce all that data and to put a report together, but I believe they likely have been working on it for a while now, getting all the pieces that they could. Before even all the data came in, they were getting all the field procedure parts of it written, likely. That's what you would typically do. So my guess would be anywhere within the 1 or 2 month time frame.
By the end of the year. All right.
I think I think that would be reasonable, yeah.
My other question is about the vertical borings. Are you satisfied that those borings are deep enough? And do you know how deep the foundation will be to reach that conclusion?
I don't know how deep the foundation will be, but the borings that have been conducted, except for 3 of all of the borings that were done, did reach a point in the vertical profile that was clean. So, assuming that I would assume that the depth of the foundation may come close to where those depths are, where they reach clean were in some cases, but I can't really speak to that because I don't know exactly what the design will look like.
So are we talking 5 or 10 feet, or are we talking 50 or 100 feet?
Oh, no. I mean, I think I don't have everything right in front of me in terms of the total boring depths, but actually, hold on one second. I do have a summary I could just take a quick look at. Generally speaking, it's either shallower than or no deeper than, looks like 15 to 18 feet. In some cases, in most cases, shallower than that, but they have reached a point at which there was nothing in the soil sample of concern at a depth of, from the looks of it, again, just generally speaking, around no deeper than 18 to 20 feet, and that would even be in most cases it's much shallower than that. Because the historic fill, I think, ranges in depth depending upon where you are on the site, and outside of the thermometer factory footprint, any impacts in soil are relatively shallow, and or related to historic fill. So the historic fill doesn't extend, that deep. It's I think the deepest would be maybe 15 to 16 feet, depending upon the location at the site.
I'm just thinking because we're talking about water lots that were created through landfill back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. What the depth might be, because obviously once you're going to put a foundation in for a very large building, it's going to have to go down 50, 60 feet.
Yeah, I mean, I think the structural foundation typically would be deep for a large structure. So again, I'm not a geotechnical engineer, so I don't really want to speak to that. But all of these details will come together when the remedial action work plan is prepared, because the intention would be to integrate the remediation into the redevelopment. So if they need to excavate to a certain depth for purposes of the foundation, the question then becomes, if that is deeper than the impacts to soil, then they're doing that excavation for foundation purposes, and how they manage the excavated soil will depend on the quality of it. So some of it may have to be managed a little differently if it has higher levels of contamination or certain parameters in it. If it turns out that for some reason the structural foundation is shallower than the depth of impacted soil, then looking at what's in the soil will drive, whether or not there's a need to go any deeper. And again, the soil will still be managed the same way based upon the quality of it. So soil that's impacted, let's say, within the thermometer factory footprint and has concentrations of mercury, where that material goes will be dictated by the concentration in the soil.
And should we be concerned
Laid out and discussed. I'm sorry?
Should we be concerned about the footprints of the old buildings that are now falling in?
Well, that's one of the things that we've talked about with the agencies is for, our concern whether or not there needs to be any additional investigation relative to air quality, as you would correlate the air quality from the RI, which was really nothing to speak of with respect to mercury, just no ambient air quality issues, just occasional detections of mercury when they were screening the cores, the actual samples that came out of the ground. That was very close to the soil. It wasn't in the ambient air. But how do you correlate that to a full-scale remediation that will have open excavations? And are you going to encounter debris that might be associated with the former thermometer factory? So these are things that the agencies are taking a look at. And again, this will all be discussed in the context of how you interpret the data from the investigation.
Yeah, just please be aware that there's the potential of cave-ins right now, because it keeps getting worse.
Yeah, I'm aware that there's subsidence concerns, and the debris that's out there. Obviously, if you look at where these sinkholes are forming, some of it may be related to shifting of debris. whether that debris is associated with just a remnant structure that's not of environmental concern, I think is the question. There's really, in the areas where the subsidence is occurring, the data aren't really showing anything with respect to mercury concentrations being elevated in soil. So whether or not that would be that debris would be of environmental concern, I think is something that will be discussed in the RI report. Because that's kind of one of the points, is trying to correlate where debris was identified, where the geophysical survey found the footprints and remnants of structures, and then where the soil and groundwater investigation would have pointed to anything, of environmental concern, and trying to link those two together. It's basically, the whole purpose behind, taking and synthesizing all of this information is to be able to relay this story, a picture. It should be clear that this was the history. This is what the geophysical survey showed. This is what the soil investigation is showing. This is how the two correlate. This is how they don't correlate. This is what we think is going on. This is what needs to be done. This is how it's going to be done. How it's going to be done comes into play largely in the remedial action work plan, which will come after the remedial investigation report. But, there's already discussion and thought about how do you link one to the other, making that transition.
I'm just going to, I was going to say, I'm going to move along if you don't mind.
Sure.
Bob Schneck, you're up next, pal.
I just wanted to ask the question. I just wanted to thank Laura for the terrific work you've done so far in interpreting all this. And I was wondering if there was any beginning to the continuation of your contract or any discussion started so far.
I think it was raised briefly on the previous EPC call. Right now, we're really focusing on finishing up on the RI data reduction. So I have not been involved in any further discussions at this point.
Is there any need to move those things forward, or are you happy with the way things are going?
Well, we still have to review, finish up our evaluation of the discussions with the agencies and then review the draft remedial investigation report. I think at that point, the discussion with respect to how best to proceed, can start. I think it might be a little too early right now because I think the, HHC and Langen are still generating data. They just finished their geotechnical investigation. I think it might be just a little premature to have that discussion, but, I'm happy to continue to assist the community if that's something that, the community desires, and how to go about that is something that still has to be, discussed, I think.
I just want to make sure that there's no break in the continuity of your work with this.
Right.
So, my impression is that the field study is actually complete, with the possibility of a couple of additions if there's a need for. So mostly this is done, and in your opinion, was it done extremely well, or done professionally?
Yes, I mean, Langen did a very professional job. All of the procedural aspects of it and the methods and procedures were all adhered to the remedial investigation work plan. They were very receptive to the times that, we had an environmental scientist come onto the site, and the data have come back, looking very good and with a high quality of reliability. So the question just becomes synthesizing all of that. And we're still looking to see, maybe a little bit of a different representation of it in a manner that might be easier for everybody to get their arms around. And DEC and DOH still have to do their final assessment of how they feel everything looks. So we're going to reserve judgment until they have their say in it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, hearing no more questions from the board, I see two people on the regular attendee list. Megan, I'm sorry, I don't know your last name. You're up.
Hey, it's Megan Malvern. Hi. Thank you
Hi.
for hosting everything, and thank you, Laura, for all your work. I had one question. Before you said you were talking about the borings, and I think you said all but one of them reached clean fill.
No,
Um,
no,
sorry.
no. They all did, other than three that hit refusal at a piece of what appears to be some type of wood or timber. But the vast majority of them did reach a soil sample point that was clean.
So all but three reached those hit refusal, and that's where then they go out laterally to try to figure out if stuff is clean, or what do they do in that instance?
Well, in the areas where you hit refusal, I think they make a judgment as to whether or not there would need to be any additional investigation vertically. Based on the data around those boring locations, they can pull that knowledge in. And then on the lateral delineation, that's where, if you have, let's say you have an exceedance at, 8 to 10 feet or 6 to 8 feet below grade, if you're boring to the north, south, east, and west is approximate to that depth, then you would have delineation. If your borings are if your samples at those locations are at distinctly different depths, then you have to interpret the data and present what you think your rationale for having said you're delineated is. And so I think that's right. That's what we're looking to see is how
Were
is that going
were
to
any
be.
of those three that had refusal, were those near any of the thermometer factory footprints?
I do not believe so. One might have been, Megan. I just don't remember off the top of my head, but I think I'm not 100% sure if it was near there or in. My recollection is that the areas of refusal were towards the south. Well, if you call Water Street south going towards Beekman, where you kind of, or even sort of south central. So I apologize. I don't have that
That's fine.
the
And
off the top of my head. Yeah.
my other quick question is, so
Yeah. Go
there's
ahead.
all the tests have been done for all these weeks, and they've been extrapolating and looking, and then they sent them to be verified by another outside party. Will that data, that's the data they shared with you? Have you gotten that back yet, or is that still being sort of verified and looked at?
Yeah, no, we have been working with preliminary data that was prior to validation. But typically, in my years of experience, typically it's unlikely to see or unusual to see anything significantly different when the validation is conducted. But we will be following up to ensure that the validated data are the data that are ultimately relied on, and those will be the ones that will be presented in the report.
Well, that's great. So of that preliminary data that you've already seen, nothing were you worried about or asked DEC or DEA to look into more, or
In terms
was there
of
anything that caused any concern?
our pointing out to the agencies was something that they were already looking at, which is essentially how do you synthesize all the data and come up with this achievement of delineation, primarily in the lateral, on the horizontal basis. How do you interpret, because there's so many soil borings that were conducted, and many of them were to delineate mercury in the thermometer factory footprint. The depth at which these borings were collected, some of them are not completely in line with where the elevated concentrations were reported. So they need to look hard at how they achieve delineation laterally.
But none of the numbers
Say
are
that
alarming.
I'm sorry.
None of the numbers are alarming.
I'm not sure what you mean.
The data from the testing, from the stuff that's being independently verified, none of that information, like mercury, elemental, any of those numbers aren't coming back with something that you are concerned about.
Well, they'll definitely, there are exceedances, and those will be addressed as part of a remediation work plan. But the data was showing very little in the way of elemental mercury. There were different types of mercury found, It wasn't primarily elemental, which fits with the fact that there was not a lot of volatilized mercury present, and they weren't seeing any major issues with mercury and vapor. So I think this is where the whole synthesizing of the data comes in. It's really important to not take one piece of information out of context, but to keep it all together and have that thorough story and character. And that is really the whole idea behind RI, is to understand and characterize and then present what your findings and how you interpret those findings. So it's really important not to take things out of context. Okay. I hope I answered your question.
I guess it's more of a waiting until we see this. I just want to know if there's things that were, for us to be paying attention to specifically. And I guess we'll find out more when all the data gets pushed together.
Right. Yeah, it's important that we don't get ahead of the report. I mean, I think that's because the report is going to be so holistic. There's going to be so many pieces to it. Yeah, Colin, I'm not hearing you. I think okay.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
It's okay.
Colin, can you say that again?
Grace Lee. There she goes.
Hi, Laura. How are you?
Good, Grace. How are you?
I'm good. I just wanted to, just to pick up where Megan left off, we had some conversations very early on with some scientists who had talked about how difficult it is to separate mercury, like elemental versus methyl mercury. So how, I mean, he said it's extremely difficult. So how accurate do you feel that those measurements are? How do we gain confidence around those measurements actually really being representing what could actually be in the soil?
Well, the analysis that was conducted was a speciation analysis, which is a specialized analysis to look at the form of mercury that was reported in the soil samples. And they adhered to the remedial investigation work plan. And the data, in my experience, there are reliable test methods for speciation. And I think the data from my review made sense in the context of the total reported mercury concentration, what was reported in the field with the Jerome meter screening, and what's being found, generally speaking, in vapor, in the soil vapor, which is really very little, if anything, and then also the air quality issue, data. So everything that we looked at seems to jive, which is one of the other ways in which you can feel more confident that the data are reliable. So again, this is why it's important not to get ahead of the report, because there's been so much data generated. It's really important for this to be all synthesized together so that you can understand the reason and the rationale for the conclusions.
Okay, great. And I'm sorry if I didn't pick up on this as clearly as may have been stated by you already, but in order in the remedial action work plan, are you expecting that the developer, that Howard Hughes is going to be, their plans for the site will be part of thinking about how the cleanup occurs? So as Michael Kramer was saying about the depths of how deep they will be digging a foundation and that sort of thing, that will all be part of how you're thinking about the work plan and how deep they go to clean out the site. Just how do those two work together?
Yeah, well, I know that the intent, from in the remedial investigation work plan, Langen and HHC state that the intent is to integrate the remediation into the redevelopment. To the extent that they're going to lay out what depth they have to excavate for redevelopment purposes, I'm not 100% sure that that will be outright stated in the work plan. The fact that they did do the geotechnical investigation already sort of suggests that they're looking to see if that would be possible to do, but I'm not sure how far ahead that design element will be before they actually generate the remedial action work plan. It can go either way. You can either have a remedial action work plan that focuses on what you need to do for remediation and talks more generally about how it's going to be integrated into redevelopment. If you're farther ahead with your redevelopment planning, then you can talk more specifically. So it really depends on where they are with the redevelopment planning when they get to the point of the remedial action work plan preparation. I think ideally they likely would like to be able to integrate the two completely. But again, it depends on, you know, where they are at that point with their redevelopment design. So I can't really speak to that specifically, but you know, that will be the next document that comes out after the remedial investigation report. So.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And then I have a general question for the community board. I don't know who might be able to help answer, but I was just curious who from the community board is interfacing with Howard Hughes regarding Laura's contract and what we can do as a community to continue to, you know, push for a conversation, you know, to happen sooner than later about, you know, continuing her contract through the remedial work, remediation.
I'm not sure how to answer that. I'm just a substitute chair, but Diana, do you have any thoughts on that? Do we know who's direct Howard Hughes on these kind of matters?
Yeah, Lucian Reynolds, who is our district manager, has been handling all the contractual stuff, along with Tammy as chair of the board. So that's something that we can definitely raise with them as a potential to identify what the next steps are and make a plan for that. And of course, Alice has been working with Tammy on that as co-chair of the board and chair of this committee.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. One last question. And for this question, I'm sorry, I should have said this earlier, but let's keep it to one follow-up. We're already 45 minutes into the meeting. We got 3 more items to go. So one follow-up, please. Ryan, sorry you're the last person to do it to, but one follow-up. Ryan, you're up.
No problem. Thanks, Colin. Hi, Laura. Thank you for all of your work. Just a quick question on your interactions with DEC. I know Komorowski retired, and now we have Heidi Dudek. How has your working relationship been there? And I guess my concern is, you know, you've been on the emails about the depression on the lot, and they indicated they would be sending out an email or instructions to HHC to put additional cones out to prevent LAZ from parking on the depression. But that still has not happened, and I think it's been a month now. So I'm just curious on your overall working relationship there and what's being done to address the depression specifically.
Yeah, no, they've been wonderful. I mean, I know it's, you know, difficult with Mike, you know, he was so intimately involved, but Rafi was as well all along, and Heidi, you know, is very senior and very experienced. And we still have the same folks from DOH, you know, Scarlett McLaughlin, and the crew has been, you know, the same people there. So there really hasn't been any hiccup or anything like that from my point of view. You know, they've been great with our ability to, you know, Tom Facil and I's ability to, you know, freely discuss, you know, any insights we have or concerns that we have. So with respect to the subsidence, I mean, I understand the concerns that they're not reacting and maybe as quickly or in the manner that you had suggested or had requested. So I will follow up with them tomorrow. I meant to do that today and I just didn't happen because I got pulled into a million different directions unexpectedly. So sorry, my kid. But yeah. Zoom meetings in the time of COVID. So but I will follow up with them, Ryan, tomorrow to see, to make sure that we have some, response back
Yeah.
that with them. Yeah.
Well, and just to comment, Heidi herself said she would be instructing them to put cones and not park on that. And, that was, I think, something you guys had previously agreed to. So just wanted to clarify. It's nothing I'm suggesting. I just want them to do what they previously have told us they would do.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah. And I don't know whether there's been communication directly with Langen and HAC or not. That's, we would not be in that direct loop. But if you're still not seeing anything done, then I'll definitely follow up and ask.
Great. Thank you.
Tomorrow, but they've been very responsive.
Great.
All right, Laura, you've been great. And unless I hear anything else, I don't see any hands up. Was there any other questions before we move on to number 2? Excellent. Laura, we'll talk to you soon. Thank you for the update.
All right, great. All right, take care, everybody. Okay.
All right, number 2 on the agenda, Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Quarterly Update from the Mayor's Office. Diana, do we have someone from the Mayor's Office here?
Yeah, we have a couple people. We have Jordan Salinger from the Mayor's Office and Will Fisher from EDC. I know they are here with a bunch of their colleagues, and including in that group is some folks from the Battery Park City Authority who are also giving their quarterly update as part of this. So, Will or Jordan, I'll leave it to you to direct your team.
Sure. So I'll start. Hi, everyone. Jordan Salinger with the Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Thanks for having us tonight. I think this is the first time that we've been able to present to this committee since January of this year. Obviously, a lot has happened since then. We've had some of our projects on hold for portions of that time. Luckily, a number of projects we've been able to restart, and you'll see some of the progress we've made, trying to make up for some of that lost time this evening. But, very clearly, challenges remain. And I think this, we'll be able to demonstrate some of the significant progress, but, very clearly with a changed economic climate, there are certainly challenges ahead. As mentioned before, joined by our friends across a number of agencies, folks from Emergency Management, City's Economic Development Corporation, Battery Park City Authority. I think folks from Parks are also with us. And kind of behind the scenes, we certainly work with a number of our other agencies, including DOT and many others. We're also joined by Mary Kimball from Arcadis. We've certainly heard in the past from this committee a desire to hear directly from some of our consultant team. And so she'll be speaking a bit to our progress on the master plan work. So with that, I want to hand it off to Will to give a bit more of background for us.
Thanks, Jordan. Good evening, everybody. Will Fisher here with the New York City Economic Development Corporation. It's nice to see everyone. Hope everybody is doing well. I've spoken with a lot of you in the meantime, but like Jordan said, we haven't had a chance to come in since, I believe, January to talk about the projects as, in any great detail. I want to give a quick update just sort of on kind of the overall status of the city operated projects, not to speak for the Battery Park City Authority's projects, which they will touch on later. But really quickly, I just wanted to give an update on sort of how these projects and how EDC's budgeting and project prioritization exercises have been happening in light of the fiscal situation caused by COVID. So as all of you probably know, in early to mid-April, the governor signed an executive order halting capital construction citywide due to obviously the dangers posed by coronavirus. There were none of the LMCR projects, the capital projects, were in construction at the time, but this was a chance for EDC and for the other city agencies that are implementing capital projects to sort of pause the work that was being done both on the capital projects that were in construction and on work that was sort of in design and along the way. So because of sort of the dual challenges of fiscal uncertainty on the revenue side, the mayor obviously announced that there would be a budget hole of several $billion between fiscal years 20 and 21, which obviously we're still dealing with. And then in addition, there was quite a lot of new spending on the emergency preparedness and response side. So EDC, for its part, was working on setting up testing locations, doing dredging for the USNS Comfort at Manhattan Cruise Terminal, producing ventilators, producing a number of other types of PPE, et cetera. So in April, just to sort of set the stage, we had sort of new spending as well as the fiscal challenges associated with significantly lower revenues. So given that, we paused at EDC all projects that were not related to COVID response in mid-April. So what that looked like through the summertime and springtime was sort of waiting to see until the budget passed in July, which obviously happened, and we sort of have a better sense right now as obviously as coronavirus has slowed down, at least in New York City, of sort of what the short to medium term impact on the cities and on EDC's finances will be and has been. So, since the budget passed for the fiscal year 21, beginning on July 1st, we've been working closely with City Hall and OMB to sort of unpause projects as best as we can and as often as we can. Obviously the city is trying to be conservative, as is EDC, in terms of maintaining enough cash on hand to respond to potentially a second wave or any other associated difficulties. So in being conservative, there are some projects that have restarted, there are some that have not. So we worked quickly, we've been working pretty closely with OMB and City Hall to figure out where we can, what the prioritization scheme is in regard to getting projects started. Folks here are familiar with the Brooklyn Bridge to Montgomery Coastal Resilience Project, which is in Community District 3 in the Two Bridges neighborhood. So that project has a significant amount of federal funding that has a spending deadline attached to it. So given that spending deadline is in place, that project has been restarted. We were lucky that the Financial District and Seaport Climate Resilience Master Plan, which is for the more or less the study area between the Whitehall Ferry Terminal and the Brooklyn Bridge, was greenlit as well. However, I do want to make sure everybody understands that right now the additional coastal resilience work that we had planned for at the Battery in terms of raising the wharf to prevent sea level rise and daily inundation of Battery Park, that is still unfortunately on pause. So we can talk about what that means in a little bit of detail later if anybody would like, but generally all of those projects are still funded. It is just a matter of current cash flow and OMB asking various city agencies to sort of pause and kind of hold on in terms of restarting these projects. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but I wanted to make sure to give that background on the city and EDC's fiscal situation as a result of these projects, and we can come back to that topic at any point within the conversation. But with that, we can start the presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Will. So to set the stage, going back to spring of 2019, Mayor made an announcement about this area and the projects, specifically that many of you were part of that process, and so this may be familiar, and I will zoom through it. But essentially, that we had done a comprehensive climate risk assessment for this neighborhood, looking at climate hazards. So not just surge, like many of you are obviously familiar from Sandy, but increasing sea level rise and more intense precipitation. Then we looked at kind of all the latest engineering available and the sort of coastal resiliency tools that we have at our disposal. Flood walls, deployable barriers, raising streets, hardening buildings, and looked block by block to see what might be possible in this neighborhood. And as part of the announcement, we were able to unveil about $500 million worth of on-land capital projects. And so, looking at the map, that's work in two bridges, the battery project mentioned before, as well as the work that Battery Park City is advancing. We were also able to announce that for the financial district in Seaport, where we looked at on-land capital projects, that we were unable to find a project, that the solutions were not deemed viable, and certainly we can kind of get into a discussion later on that piece. But that a next phase of work was necessary to look at in-water options, specifically for that neighborhood to protect against surge, sea level rise, and increased precipitation. Next slide. So I think this is always important. This is not the only work that has gone on. That study that I mentioned at the beginning of the previous slide, you see the image there, the Lower Manhattan Climate Resilience Study. First of its kind, comprehensive risk assessment, looking well into the future. But that all built on top of significant work that this community has been involved in and helped to support, and further, dating back to the SIR report that many folks are familiar with from the end of the Bloomberg administration. The Big U, the Rebuild by Design effort, looking at a series of on-land options, as well as the Southern Manhattan Coastal Protection Study, or Seaport City, as many of you are familiar with, kind of back of the house study of feasibility of exactly what we'll be discussing a little bit later, some of the in-water protection necessary to protect against these threats. So that's the background. We're now going to jump briefly into some updates from our friends at Emergency Management and their interim flood protection measures program, and then we'll pick back up with the long-term work in a second.
Thanks, Jordan. This is Susan Rosen from New York City Emergency Management. Most of you know I'm the Deployables Program Manager, and I oversee the Interim Flood Protection Measures Program. So before I update you on potential projects in Lower Manhattan, I was asked to provide a brief summary of our deployment at South Street Seaport for Tropical Storm Isaias. As you can see on the timeline, New York City Emergency Management was monitoring the storm as of July 24th, when it was a tropical disturbance in the Atlantic. Over the next 6 days, it continued to develop and move west until it became a Category 1 hurricane on July 30th and was forecast to move up the coast with potential impacts to New York City. The timing for 0 hour, or the arrival of tropical storm force winds, was estimated to be sometime on Tuesday, August 4th. NISM continued to monitor the storm and convened the Coastal Storm Steering Committee on July 31st. These calls are held to bring all the involved agencies and organizations together to provide the latest forecast information, discuss components of the plan, such as sheltering or the downtree task force, what steps agencies and organizations are taking to prepare for the storm, such as delivering extra meals to the elderly or relocating movable assets. IFPM is one of the many pieces of the plan. As part of New York City Emergency Management's continued monitoring, we looked at the worst case flooding models. These models are based on thousands of previous storms tracking in the same direction with similar forward speeds, and they consistently showed that South Street Seaport was the only IFPM site that was at risk under the predicted conditions. So following the Coastal Storm Steering Committee call, the internal NISM IFPM team discussed the models and options for an activation, and we reached out to our local just-in-time vendor, Tully Construction, letting them know that Isaias might impact the city, and we discussed the timing and the actions that would be needed. The forecast remained consistent into Saturday, August 1st, and IFPM received instructions to activate at approximately 6:20 p.m. We immediately notified the vendor and all our agency partners, and we held a lead team conference call and a traffic management call that Saturday night. And then, although the turnaround time from receiving the go-ahead was fairly short, Tully was fully staffed and ready to go at 7 a.m. Sunday morning with over 82 laborers, additional supervisors, foremen, and skilled operators. Just to give you some background, laying out and connecting the tiger dams is the most time-consuming and labor-heavy part of the deployment, and the first day was devoted just to that activity. On Monday, August 3rd, work started again at 7 a.m., and by 11 p.m. that night, all tiger dams and just-in-time HESCOs were in place within the targeted time of 12 hours before 0 hour. As directed, Tully returned at 7 a.m. on Tuesday with a small crew to address any issues that might have arisen overnight, and this check was completed and the crew departed at 10:15 a.m. The storm arrived in New York City in the early afternoon with very strong winds, causing a great deal of damage and power outages across the city, but the potential surge impacts did not materialize. This was mainly due to an earlier arrival time, avoiding the high tide, and the fact that the storm development happened relatively quickly, preventing it from building the energy that pushes the surge. We began demobilization at 7 p.m. by removing tiger dams from the entrance to Smith houses. And we also opened all the valves on all of the tiger dams along the rest of the alignment to allow a slow dewatering overnight. Crews arrived at 7 a.m. Wednesday morning to start the demobilization and continued on Thursday when all of the measures were removed and roads were reopened by 1 p.m. Next slide, please. So these are some photos from the deployment. The picture on the left is under the FDR just at the Promenade and Wall Street. The next picture over is looking down Catherine Slip towards South Street. So those are the tiger dams outside Smith houses. Then on the top right picture, those are some just-in-time HESCOs being filled at the corner of Wall Street. And then the tiger dams crossing Wall Street there in the bottom picture on the right. As I mentioned, this was the first time that we have deployed at any IFPM site outside of our annual exercises. And it was a tremendous opportunity to review the plans and assumptions that are the basis for the IFPM program. As with all NISM emergency responses, we follow up our actions with a deep look at what went well and what lessons can be learned from the experience. Since the deployment, we've conducted internal and interagency hot washes. These are conversations designed to gather a wide perspective and information across all aspects of the deployment. We're still in the process of analyzing and organizing that information and feedback for Isaias, but we'd like to share some of those achievements and items for future consideration with you. As the most public and heavily trafficked site, South Street Seaport is certainly the most challenging deployment. And again, this activation provided a great many observations that we can use to improve across the program. I would say that one big achievement was that we were able to validate our expected time frame. We completed the deployment as we expected. The total work hours was about 27 hours, and then the demob took about 20 hours. So that was just a good exercise for us across our whole program to be able to validate our timeline. I'm going to say again, there were no injuries or property damage. Obviously, this is always the standard, but at a site this big and this public in particular, there are many challenges to site safety. It's very difficult in New York City to make people understand why they shouldn't put themselves in danger when they want to go somewhere and they just are determined to go the way they want to go no matter what. So many people were ignoring all the safety warnings from our uniformed officers and our contractors, et cetera. Another achievement is that the interagency cooperation just went very, very well. Again, the lack of injuries is a testament to that. Everyone was really amazingly helpful and really on board with making this happen in the best way possible. Some of the future considerations. This activation happened in the absence of an evacuation order, and this is, a new scenario for us. It was not something that really had been part of our plan. We always had talked about only doing this in the event of an evacuation, but this limited impact that was predicted really only called for us to protect the site and not really call for the evacuation across the city. But it did bring complications, and we are looking at those very closely to see what we can do if we are asked to do this again in a limited way at any of our sites. It increases our ability to respond if we're able to do this, but it does have impacts, especially the residents at Ms. Smith houses were impacted, some businesses in the area were impacted, and again, we're looking at ways to ameliorate those impacts if we should do it again. site safety and traffic management. Like I said, even though we achieved this without any injuries or any damage, we understand that this can be a major inconvenience to the community when we have to shut down streets, and it's absolutely necessary. But we do want to try to be mindful and think about if we can do this in a way that has a less impact on the community. So we're looking to try to think about that for the future. Just to mention, the end word on traffic management, of course, is with the police department, but we do want to try to plan as much as we can to try to ease that restriction. Communication, we do see a lot of room for improvement in communicating with the community on what would happen during the deployment and putting out more messaging during the deployment. We're already starting to implement that into our plans. I do just want to say that one great way to stay informed about IFPM or any emergency in New York City is to sign up for Notify NYC, which you can Google at Notify NYC or call 311 to sign up for that. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an update on the potential IFPM projects in Lower Manhattan. So as most of you know, we have been working with our engineering team to look at South Street Seaport to evaluate alternative measures in the hopes that we could find a just-in-time measure that might be more efficient, cutting the time we need to deploy, and also with less impact to the community, as well as mitigating the everyday presence of the current measures. We had been focusing on a measure called aquafence, but in late winter and early spring, our engineers provided some feedback that raised a lot of concerns as to its suitability for South Street Seaport. These concerns mainly revolved around its ability to withstand potential wave action, as well as issues with the need to anchor the aquafence. The subsurfaces along much of the alignment of South Street Seaport would not provide sufficient anchorage for this measure. So as we review the ISAIAS activation and review with our engineers, we will continue to consider either alternative measures or perhaps changes to the current alignment if there are gains to be found in shortening the just-in-time timeline, mitigating the daily impacts, or improving the alignment. I think that Will gave us a very clear picture of how COVID-19 has impacted the city agencies and programs, and IFPM is no different. I would have to say the biggest impact for IFPM is probably on the progress on the analyses for the Tribeca and South Street Seaport extension areas. These analyses were paused in the spring as non-essential work was put on hold, and emergency management staff and all of our city agency partners were pulled into work related to the COVID-19 response. IFPM budget allocations do not carry over from one year to the next. We are funded each year. Prior to the onset of the COVID-19 emergency in New York City, IFPM had made its budget presentation to the city and fully expected to receive continued funding for the remaining analysis and possibly potential designs. However, when the budget was allocated in June for this fiscal year, our budget, as all budgets across all agencies and programs, was cut dramatically. At the moment, our priority must be the operational requirements of current sites. Emergency management, the interim flood protection measures program, and the city fully understand the criticality of protecting these areas and the importance of finding solutions for the community. But as we evaluate the South Street Seaport deployment and extrapolate the lessons for other neighborhood sites, we are also taking this opportunity to reevaluate how best to protect them and to find the appropriate balance between the measures and the daily life of the area. It's also noted that the long-term capital projects are in flux, and it's extremely important that we, design and have our timelines for IFPM tie into the engineering for those sites as well, and be able to work around those plans. Just to let you know, we do typically have opportunities later in the year to revise our funding requests, and we will be requesting that we be able to restart these analyses. But at this time, we have no way of knowing if and when that might happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. So let's go to the next slide. So now reorienting yourself from the day-to-day and then the interim flood protection measures back to the long-term work here. As mentioned before, in the financial district and Seaport, we were unable to find an on-land capital project, and so have started to advance a study looking at in-water protection for the neighborhood. As part of this effort, we have brought on a tremendous team, and we'll be joined by one of the members shortly. But just to give folks a reminder of the goals of this work, we're really trying to determine the extent of the shoreline extension as part of this work. I think this graphic doesn't always do us justice here, but it really trying to show the potential extent. By no means is there a scenario where we're going kind of all the way out across the project area, but just really to give you a sense of where we're looking at and the extent of the study area. By 2021, the summer, about a year from now, we're hoping to develop a conceptual design of coastal defense infrastructure to protect this neighborhood, and a preliminary design of a first phase project. We are also looking at implementation plan for the financing, construction, and governance. We realize this is a unique effort, and so the sort of specifically in terms of financing, construction, and governance, we will be looking at kind of new models that help to support these efforts. Certainly, given the in-water aspects of this work, we've already started to work with our state and federal agencies, and will continue to do so. They are truly the decision maker as it relates to this in-water work, and we'll follow their lead in terms of deeming what is and what is not possible in efforts to protect from flooding. Also, as many of you know, and has been focus of a number of presentations before, we're planning to create a drainage plan to upgrade the sewer system in response to these risks. We know that capacity starts to become very constrained, certainly in the future. And so drainage is essential and will be part of the plan, and you should be expecting significant detail on that in the future. So with that, we'll hand it off to Mary Kimball from Arcadis to get into the details of what we've been up to.
Mary, we can't hear you. I don't actually see it either.
I see that Mary's unmuted. Mary,
Yeah.
are you on?
Yeah, I see her, and she was speaking, but I don't see that she's muted either. Yep, still can't hear you. Mary, if you can hear us, it's on your end. Nope. It's not just me, right, Diana?
No, it's not. I see that Mary is unmuted. We just we can't hear you, Mary.
I think the best option at this point, if you can't figure it out on your computer, Mary, is just to dial in. And while we wait, Diana will sing us a song.
It's terrible. Nobody wants to hear that. Will or Jordan, do you want to move on to another section while Mary figures out her tech issues?
Yeah, I mean, I guess are there any questions in the meantime about the content we covered so far? It is quite a long presentation with the multiple agencies.
Yeah, Will, I can't worm. Just wait till the end.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
No problem. Elijah or Jocelyn, do you maybe want to kick us off through this question? Or through this section? Otherwise, we can...
Hey, can you all hear me now?
There she goes. Okay.
Nice.
Okay,
Welcome.
great. All right. So sorry about that. I don't know, WebEx sometimes I have issues with. But anyway, as I was saying, my name is Mary Kimball. I'm the urban planner with the firm Arcadis, and we're the lead consultant on this project with a lot of other consultants with us leading all various aspects of this project. A little bit about me too. I'm an urban planner. I've been working on coastal resiliency and waterfront planning projects in New York City for about a decade. I actually worked on the comprehensive waterfront plan that was issued 10 years ago, not the current one that's in development, but the prior iteration of it. And it's been, very, very excited to sort of bring all of that experience to bear on this very exciting project too. So in terms of the team, Arcadis is leading on the engineering and design of all the resiliency infrastructure, including from a in-water and maritime perspective, as well as upland and tie-ins. We're also working with Matrix New World, who's an expert on maritime structures, as well as transportation maritime structures. And Sam Schwartz Engineering is also supporting from an engineering planning perspective. Arcadis is also leading on the drainage modeling, as well as the hydrodynamic modeling, really to make sure that we understand the existing drainage system and incorporating any strategies into the plan that are necessary from a drainage perspective. And then on the hydrodynamic modeling, making sure that we understand what potential impacts of the project could be on the habitats and ecology of the East River, as well as potential impacts on navigation and water structures. On the permitting and environmental side, we have a very experienced team with Cy Padgett Rizel and AKRF, as well as Matrix New World. We've actually begun doing the habitat and biological sampling to inform the permitting and the design. And then from an urban design standpoint, we have SCAPE on landscape architecture, as well as ONE architecture. And we're also looking across implementation from financial analysis. DJH advisors and Ernst & Young are working on financial modeling. And then a lot of everyone really on this team is involved in the stakeholder and public engagement. SCAPE is working with us on the website, and really the intention is to bring all of the various expertise from these teams into the public conversation and bring all the information that we're doing and we're analyzing so that we're all working from the same information. And next slide. So what have we done so far? Since we had this 4-month pause, really kind of now making sure we're hitting the ground running and really trying to make sure that we're able to accomplish everything that's needed to be done within the timeline for this project. Our focus recently has been really diving into the existing conditions to make sure we understand the opportunities and constraints, looking across the board at the coastal defense potential alignments, the drainage system, transportation and maritime infrastructure, ecology, urban design ideas, as well as the funding and financing pathways. Part of this has been looking globally at innovative precedents, to making sure we're understanding really what could be innovative and potential for this area and for this project. We've also begun working directly with the regulators through an Aquatic Resources Advisory Committee to make sure we understand what are their questions and concerns about the project, and we're starting to advance the habitat sampling in order to set that understanding of baseline conditions. I mentioned some of the hydrodynamic modeling we're doing of looking at the range of potential options, what the potential impacts could be. And on outreach, we've held a climate coalition last year, at the end of last year. And then earlier this year, before our pause, we had a public open house to really begin to share all these materials, and we'll be doing more of that in the future. And right now we're shifting to a remote engagement through meetings like this, as well as the engagement portal, the website, and other virtual workshops as well. So I mentioned the harbor sampling that's actually been going on right now. It's really exciting to start to see actually beginnings of implementation happening. And really it's an exciting opportunity to really get a better understanding of the baseline conditions in the harbor. There isn't existing information like we're gathering now that's been done in this modern era. So really kind of a critical process to make sure we're understanding what are the existing conditions, what are we working with, in order for us to understand what the potential impacts of working in this area may be. So here's our schedule. As we mentioned with this 4-month pause, we really now need to be working on on all steam to move forward and meet the overall project schedule at the same time. So we've been working on developing our evaluation framework to understand to set up sort of that criteria that we'll be using to evaluate options. Been doing the hydrodynamic modeling as well as interior drainage modeling, and then really looking across all of those project systems, transportation, maritime, drainage, bringing all that information together to understand what we call the solution space. What is the space that defines what is possible for this project and for this area? What are the sort of guardrails, things that are not possible? Making sure that we push on that to make sure that we're not eliminating solutions that are feasible, but also taking into account things that are just not possible. And we're using our understanding of that to begin then developing the initial options for both on-land and in-water options. And then we'll be coming back to the public and to you all next year once we sort of have a sense of what those options are, and we can begin to refine and evaluate those. We're also thinking about placemaking opportunities in the area, and first understanding, what are our urban design principles and goals for that. And then on implementation, mentioned the habitat and biological sampling. We're also doing a lot of research into potential funding and financing options, thinking about what are the potential scale of different options, and what would we need to advance in order to make those options real. And I'll pass it over to Will to talk about the engagement.
Yeah, so dovetailing with what Mary was saying, I think, one of the key points we want to make sure to get across today is that, we were very lucky to have the 5-day Seaport Master Plan continue to be funded during fiscal year 21. But that also means that we have to do, the same amount of work that we were intending to do before, which is already quite rushed and constrained, I think, in a shorter amount of time. So, we have an excellent team on board. We want to continue to bring the consultants themselves to these and other meetings so that, the public has a chance to interact with the experts who are doing this work and this research. But we also, do need to make sure that we stay really closely aligned with the community board and with the public in general as we continue to go through the process, because there is, quite honestly, there is a lot of work still to be done. And I think, one of the biggest things that we're beginning to kind of tease out over the next few months and into next summer is looking at the very real alternatives and sort of trade-offs and decision making that we'll have to go through to figure out, like Mary said, with all of these various work streams, as well as the sort of question of financing for this project and what is actually implementable. Those are going to be things that we're going to be discussing with the public quite a bit. So you can see here at the bottom on the engagement touch points, like Mary said, we had a few events to be spoken for earlier this year. But we're really looking forward to the second meeting of the Climate Coalition, which is our sort of small stakeholder group, which generally we're meeting with them in advance of meeting with the public. And we're also looking to launch a remote engagement tool and website probably in the next month or so. Blake, can we see the next slide, please? So just to recap, I hope that folks here were able to make it. I know that just looking through the attendance list, that many of you were able to make it, but we really try to set the bar high for ourselves in terms of getting this information to the public. So we had an event in February at Pace's Downtown Conference Center where we had sort of a kind of 2-room museum exhibit type setup for our engagement here. So there was one room related specifically to the risks. So what does unmitigated climate change in Lower Manhattan specifically look like? So we talked about sunny day flooding, tidal inundation. We talked about storm surge. You can see Val from Community Board 3 here with the VR goggles. So we had a sort of virtual reality simulation, which is still available on YouTube, and we would love for everybody to be able to see that. Showing what it would look like to stand at the corner of Wall Street and South Street if the city and if we all do nothing about climate change. So we were really glad to have hundreds and hundreds of folks turn out for that. Again, have those touch points directly, having the public interact with the engineers who are doing this work for us. So we really want to try to get foster that really in-depth conversation as much as possible. So we got a lot of great feedback there, and I think we want to continue to sort of engage with the public in a way that allows this feedback to flow. I won't read through all of this, but there's definitely the desire to get more into the nitty-gritty and the kind of engineering details. So as we continue to think about pivoting from in-person to online engagement, we're going to be releasing a engagement tool and new website here in the next month or two, which will really provide not just information out to the public, but really provide a way for those two-way conversations to happen with, sort of like ask an expert feature, commenting features, sort of place-based individual comments on the project, et cetera. We heard that the public really wants something to. The public doesn't just want this to be another study. We want to together come up with something that is able to be implemented and able to be funded. And then we also just talked about sort of down the road, what are the decisions that we're going to need to make and the trade-offs. So we talked about the potential to use this as a way to create parks and open space. We talked about the need to handle drainage capacity issues in Lower Manhattan, and making this something that's accessible to the neighborhood and sort of respects the various urban contexts, from the very dense financial district to the historic South Street Seaport. So I think with all of that, we want to make sure that at the core we are really designing resilience infrastructure, but we do want to make sure, obviously, that the rest of those priorities are taken into account. Blake, could we go to the next slide, please? So again, I won't read through all of this, but I think, as I've touched on, I think the community board meetings are but one way that we want to enable the public to engage with us. We frankly can't do a project that is so big and important just alone and sort of in a silo. So I think in terms of connecting with all of our different agencies, both at the city level, state and federal levels, there is a lot of sort of regulatory framework in place that we need to work together with. But there's also a lot of chances, and we want to create those chances for the public to give input. So we hear a lot about transportation and making sure that Lower Manhattan remains accessible for people who live and work here. We hear a lot about historic preservation and respecting the South Street Seaport. We hear a lot about making sure that community is at the table, and not just the most engaged folks, but also folks who don't have access to the internet, folks who are outside the typical engagement processes, and also young people. We've had some great conversations with the Blue School and with the Harbor School and Peck Slip School. So we're really excited to be reaching out and engaging more to the young folks that are really going to be experiencing the threats of climate change most acutely. And I think more than anything, what is important to restate here is, we want to be partners with the community here. We have sort of this multi-tiered engagement approach with the Climate Coalition, which has representatives from a number of the sort of community institutions that we work with, as well as citywide resilience folks. We also have a number of touch points with the elected officials and community boards. We've committed to coming here quarterly. We're also looking, since there is just frankly so much content here, into getting into individual subject areas. So over the next few months, we're working on sort of an idea to come up with smaller, more bite-sized workshops on individual portions of the study. So there are, for example, like Mary said, the transportation work stream, the historical preservation work stream. We want to make sure that, for the folks who have interest in contributing to one, or just finding out more about one of these kind of bite-sized pieces of what is a very large and complex project, that we provide those opportunities. And with that, we can go to the next slide. Sorry, I forgot about this last slide. But yeah, so this sort of sums up kind of what I was saying last. But I think the ongoing meetings with a number of layers of groups that I've talked about. Our new website is going to be debuting next month. We're also, again, we've heard a lot of strong feedback to make sure that, in the time of COVID, it's important that we don't just rely on the internet as much as we're all getting used to using Zoom and WebEx, et cetera. We still want to be creative and try to get in front of folks as much as possible with physical materials, whether that is, posters and flyers up and about in the community. We've used Link NYC, smaller meetings, walking tours, that kind of stuff. And with that, we can go to the next slide. Great. So I can deliver this slide really quickly. Like I mentioned earlier, and like Susan touched on in her part regarding the Office of Emergency Management's interim flood protection, We are unfortunately not able to restart the Battery Wharf project yet. As a short reminder, this is a project to raise the existing wharf, so you would actually walk up a few steps instead of down a few steps to access the waterfront for Battery Park. Essentially, looking towards the future, the battery is slated to be subject to nearly daily or monthly tidal inundation, depending on how far out you look. So this project is really an effort to protect the park and the infrastructure around and beneath it from those threats. So, like I mentioned, for now we are unfortunately still on pause. This is something that we continue to get updates on every week and every month from the city's Office of Management and Budget and from City Hall. But unfortunately, this project is still on pause. I do want to make sure to mention that that does not mean the project is not funded. There is still funding in the long-term capital budget, but we just aren't able to move on that right now. So, in the meantime, we are doing what we can in-house. So we did begin design in November of, actually, that should say 2019. We began design with Stantec in November of 2019. We also released a procurement and selected Hunter Roberts Construction Group for to actually construction manage the project once we have a project designed. And I do want to be clear that the timing of the pause with all of this, we were just about to come out to Community Board 1 and to the public regarding sort of the first touch points with designing and brainstorming around this project. So I don't want anyone to feel like we are kind of rushing ahead behind the scenes. We are really just getting started with design on this and really hope to get back to work soon so that we can begin speaking with the community. Next slide. And with that, I think I saw Nick Spordone, but I know Gwen Dawson is on and Jennifer is on and others. So we'll turn it over here to BBCA.
Hello, this is Gwen Dawson. Can you hear me?
Hi, Gwen. Yes, we can.
Hi. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be with you this evening. Thanks for asking us to participate. I'll give you a little bit of an update on the Battery Park City projects. And it's good to hear about all of the other projects that are moving forward. There have been some developments, and I'll go through them each project individually. But just to summarize, on the South Battery Park City project, which is depicted on the illustration here, we have made a decision to switch from an environmental assessment to an environmental impact statement. And that is something that we decided over the course of the past several months. We are at 75% design on the project right now. I'll go through a little bit more of the schedule expectations as we move along on the slides here. The North Battery Park City project, last time we had an update for you. That project was moving forward at about, it was coming up on 30% design. We have 30% design now. We have had identified an alignment. We have likewise decided to move that project to an EIS rather than an EA. One additional thing that has impacted that project is that in the spring of this year, Battery Park City Authority received design build authority from the state, and we spent quite a bit of time really looking very closely at how we might utilize that authority to the benefit of our projects here. And we were looking specifically at the North project and the West project, which we were about to begin design on this year, and have concluded that combining the North and the West into a single progressive design build project is going to be the best way forward for those projects. And then finally, our ball fields resiliency project. We have a contractor ready to go, and we're working on revocable consent that hopefully will allow us to get underway very soon. Our objective is to get this in place before next year's storm season. We can move forward now. Next slide. On the south, as I mentioned, that we are at 75% design, and we are going forward with the EIS. That process has started. We've also begun a more concentrated design effort for interior drainage. I heard a couple of people earlier talking about the need for interior drainage. That's something that has been an added complication for this project and has factored significantly into the decision to switch to an EIS, since we are expecting at this point that with the interior drainage work that our construction period will now exceed 2 years. We're hopeful not by much, but we do expect that it will exceed 2 years. We are anticipating the completion of our EIS next fall in November. We will be getting to 100% design in the spring of 2021 with our target of final PDC approval at that time, with construction expected to commence in November of next year. We anticipate that we will be completed with construction in early 2024. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Okay. On the North project, as you can see in the illustration, this project has identified a preferred alignment that extends along the north esplanade of Battery Park City, up the west side of Route 9A, across Route 9A, north to North Moore, where it would proceed east to Greenwich Street. That was arrived at after a couple of public meetings and preliminary design work and engineering work by AECOM. We anticipate that although we have now decided to combine this project with the West project, that the work that's been done by AECOM at this point will inform the project moving forward. And for those who may not be familiar with what progressive design build is, design build, as many of you may know, combines the design and the contract and construction functions with a single contractor. Progressive design build is similar, except that it provides a little bit more flexibility and leeway on the front end for design, so that we can have a lot more in the way of community involvement in formulating the appropriate design response before we get to a point of an actual commitment on a price for the construction. So we felt that it provided us with a significant amount of flexibility, which is something that we felt was really important for a project such as this, that really we want to have a significant amount of community interface on. We can go to the next one. I know that we don't have an illustration for the West, but let me just tell you a little bit about the west. The west project would connect where the north project terminates on the west end, just about the west side of Stuyvesant, around North End Avenue and Chambers Street, along the waterside edge of Battery Park City, to connect with the northwestern terminus of the south project on First Place. The objective at this point is to procure a consulting engineer, who will act as the owner's rep for Battery Park City Authority as we proceed through the procurement process for the progressive design build contractor. That RFP for the consulting engineer is going to be released in the next 30 days or so. And then we expect that we will have requests for qualifications issued for a progressive design build contractor in the spring of 2021. An RFP following that, and a progressive design build contractor under contract by the fall of next year. That will then move forward with design and an EIS in parallel. And we are anticipating that once we have the progressive design build contractor on board, that there will be some time and schedule efficiencies that will allow it to move forward at a rapid pace at that point. So moving on to the ball fields project, we are, as I mentioned earlier, about to begin construction on this project. We have made some design modifications in response to some comments from the Public Design Commission, are working with New York City DOT on a revocable consent. We just discovered that SBS now has to be an additional signature on the revocable consent. So we might get pushed back a little bit on the starting point, but our end point, we are really focused on having this in place by next summer for the 2021 storm season. So that is all I have for the update tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. So I think we have one more slide just to wrap things up for folks. I know that we went through a ton of material, but just to give you a sense of some upcoming engagement for these projects, I was talking to Nick earlier tonight from the authority, and there's an upcoming meeting for the South Project in December, coming to this committee. As mentioned before, a lot of work on FIDI Seaport, including the interactive community portal that we're hoping to roll out next month. The Brooklyn Bridge Montgomery project outside of this community board, but still chugging along. Went to PDC today and having an upcoming meeting either in November or December. And so with that, I think it's a good spot to open up for questions.
Okay, this is Colin, chairing the committee. So it doesn't look like we have a lot of questions just yet, but in preparation for such a long presentation, I'll just ask everyone to ask one question, please, on the first round. And if you have another one, we'll get back to you. Anyone from Community Board 1 members have any questions, please raise your hand digitally. Jeff Galloway, go ahead.
Hi. My question's for Gwen. Could you just elaborate a little bit on the difference between an EA and EIS and why the decision was made to go from one to the other?
Sure, and I will also open it up to for assistance from our Director of Design, Jenny Dudgeon, who is also on the line. The environmental assessment an environmental review mechanism that is chosen when there's not significant impact anticipated, which was the case when we first started this project. We had some concepts in mind that included mostly deployable elements for storm protection. We had an expectation in terms of what the ultimate design flood elevation would be that we wanted to design to. That turned out to be lower than what we actually need, and which then created the need to switch from a deployable focused solution to a more passive focused solution, and that created some additional footprint that was impacted by the project. Once we were looking at adding in the interior drainage, which also became clearer that that was going to be a much more significant element of the project after we started. That was going to further expand the footprint of where we were impacting, and also would likely increase the construction duration. We had originally expected that we would have a construction duration of less than 2 years. With the addition of the interior drainage, we are expecting that to be slightly over 2 years. So the EIS provides a much more robust review that looks at alternatives. There is an expansive scoping of the project that's done. There is a very robust opportunity for community public involvement. So, a variety of studies that we are expected to complete to determine what, if any, mitigation may be required for any impacts that we would have on or around the site. So it's a more complex, lengthier project. Jenny, is there something else that you want to add to that?
Hi, Jenny here. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. No, Gwen, I think you covered it very comprehensively. I think it's the added complexity really required a much more holistic and comprehensive assessment to ensure that we are obviously covering all grounds.
And in terms of the timing, I think you said that at least one of the EISs, I think for the South project, was projected for November of next year. Is that the final one after all the public comment, or is that when it will be released?
That would be when it would be completed. The final EIS would be completed.
Okay,
so there will be a very active process that includes public engagement between now and then. We will. I know AECOM is working on an updated schedule to make sure that people are aware of exactly what is happening when.
So do you have a target date of when we would be seeing the preliminary or the draft EIS? And sort of a corollary question, is it going to be on different time frames for each of these projects, or are they on kind of a parallel time frame in terms of the EISs?
Yeah, I don't have a date to give you a target date for the draft EIS, but that will be coming shortly. We'll be getting that out to you very soon. As far as the timelines for the EISs, the EIS for the South will be proceeding in advance of the EIS for the north, the combined, newly combined north and west project, which will likely be starting sometime in the latter half of next year.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm actually going to ask one quick question myself. I know this is a long way off, but I asked this question last year and I never got an answer to it. But in terms of the extension of the shoreline, do we know yet how that would be zoned? And can we get a guarantee that it wouldn't be zoned residential?
Hey, Colin, this is Will, and the project team can jump in if they need to. So yeah, it's a good question. I think we are to be very clear. We've said this before. We are considering. We are looking at development as one of the potential options. But I think what's important to remember here is that this is a resilience first project, and I think we are looking at the development from the lens of what could potentially help pay for the project. I think we're all curious what's going to happen with the election here in a couple of weeks. I think we do want to leave all options on the table in terms of creative financing and creative ways to get this thing built, because we do need to protect Lower Manhattan sooner rather than later. And that is something I think that we are going to be looking at as we get into the sort of preliminary options with the public, probably sort of in the spring of next year. We'll have all that laid out really clearly in terms of what those trade-offs might be, if we think there even is capacity for if there even is capacity for development to help pay for some of that. So it is on the table, but I think I do want to highlight that in contrast to some previous plans and some previous studies that have been done, we are looking at this from resiliency first, and how do we get the resiliency project done. Team, is there anything else that I should add on that?
I think you said. Yeah, I mean, I can only speak for myself, and I'm going to move on to Michael Francoeur after this, Michael. But I can speak only for myself, but I could never personally support anything that had anything driving it related to that. I mean, I think we need more green space, and every time we have green space, we keep getting it gobbled up, whether it's 250 Water Street or Governor's Island, we're losing it. So I would just ask you guys to consider that very strongly.
Sure.
Mike,
Great. Thanks, Colin. Yeah, thanks for the presentation, everyone. It's good to hear from everyone again. So I think my question is probably for you, Will, or your team at EDC. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on why you weren't able to find a viable option on land for the FIDI and South Street Seaport area. And I know you've spoken to that before, so you don't have to get into all the details, but if you could just summarize that again.
Yeah, of course. Good question, Michael. And I think we are going to be, we have heard that question as well, as you said a few times. So I think as we continue to roll out sort of more of the in-depth and technical material in the next few months, I think we're really going to be focused on that. I'll turn it over to Mary here in a second from Arcadis, but really quick, generally we looked and saw that the sort of, nothing is totally impossible necessarily with with a project that is expensive enough, but I think we're looking at what is actually able to be permitted under the current regime, what is able to be financed under the current regime. Just speaking of construction costs and that kind of thing, there is obviously a significant amount of subgrade infrastructure with the various subway tunnels, the Battery Park underpass, the elevated FDR. You have sort of a unique confluence of sort of complicating factors and infrastructure. If you look up the river towards the East Side Coastal Resilience Project, for example, they had they have a wide park area to deal with in terms of where to put the coastal protection infrastructure. In the Two Bridges neighborhood, we are able to fit the sort of deployable floodgates of the appropriate height beneath the FDR. But as you get closer to the harbor, the projected surge heights get higher and higher. So we weren't able to fit with both the FDR sort of, we did look at that as an alternative, that with both the FDR sort of decreasing in grade toward the Battery Tunnel and the increasing risk as you get closer to the mouth of the harbor, there's frankly not enough space to fit deployable gates beneath the FDR. So there's a number of factors like that, but obviously understand, Michael, that we obviously understand, Michael, that the public does want to hear what those alternatives are, or what those reasons are. Mary, is there anything that you'd like to add on that from your perspective as on the engineering team?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered it well, Will. I mean, it really is about those spatial constraints. The underground infrastructure is a major reason and major challenging factor here. And then I think with both the higher flood elevations and lower ground elevations, and just that sort of clearance questions with the FDR drive, it was really sort of part of the initial analysis and initial reasoning behind not being able to find an on-land solution or strategy here. But it is still something that, that we're working on analyzing and want to, understood that we want to share that analysis and that information with you all. It's very critical to the regulatory conversation as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. And yeah, so I will put Michael in the chat. If Diana or whoever's behind the controls wouldn't mind sending it out, the original LMCR report from March 2019, which has sort of some of the things that we looked at. But like Mary said, and we'll continue to have this conversation with the public as well as the regulatory agencies. But quite frankly, we cannot build, or a shoreline extension will not be permitted by the state DEC and by Army Corps, et cetera, if we don't have a compelling reason and sort of unless it's the only option. So we will continue to sort of make that case with the regulatory community, and we'll share that feedback with you all as well.
Great, thanks. And one quick follow-up. You mentioned, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Is that for me? Cool, I'll try again. So I kept hearing the FDR seems to be a primary reason why you guys weren't able to come up with a viable on-land solution. I'm curious, did you look at any possible solutions that involved like getting rid of the FDR perhaps below like the Brooklyn Bridge? And I don't know if you had any data on what the expected lifetime of the FDR is. I know they're having a conversation across in Brooklyn about the same situation with the BQX running through Brooklyn Heights. But I also am not as familiar with, you did mention underground infrastructure, so I don't know if that also complicates the issue.
Yeah, of course. And Michael, I got to be honest, it's great to hear, this is the sort of big thinking that we're really excited to be doing during this project, thinking about, does the FDR need to remain? Obviously, there's a lot of other agencies and other stakeholders at the table when discussing that, but this is an opportunity to ask that question and sort of look at what alternatives might be. We haven't proposed any alternatives yet. We're still sort of in existing conditions analysis, and we'll be rolling out sort of the beginnings of alternative next spring, which we'll be obviously discussing with you all. So right now we're sort of in existing conditions mode, and like Mary said earlier, sort of defining what the parameters are. So like, what's the bare minimum that a resiliency project here should do? What would we aspire for it to do, et cetera? So we're sort of setting the guardrails and the guidelines right now. The FDR is certainly something that we're looking at. We do have Sam Schwartz retained on the consultant team for their transportation expertise. So that is something that we'll be looking at, and looking forward to discussing that with you more.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. Yeah, I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Mike. Bob, you're up. Bob Speck.
Okay, on.
Hello, Bob.
Hello. I just wanted to thank everyone for a really remarkable presentation, because in my memory, this is the first time that we've gotten a kind of comprehensive look at the whole project of Southern Manhattan, and I think that's an important start to all this. Since I'm limited to when I think about all this, the word that comes is urgency, and that we never can tell in any particular storm season, as we face another Sandy anniversary, what's going to happen. So always, from my point of view, there's an urgency in getting these things done as expediently and economically as possible. But if I'm limited to one question here, my concern is community input. We had a meeting last winter, and then there was a community open house since then, and there's one community open house coming up, and I really think that that's insufficient. So I would like to encourage more interactions with Community Board 1 and the Environmental Protection Committee, and I wanted to find out, is that possible? And the other kind of inside this is the question, is the shoreline extension the same project as the FIDI Seaport Climate Resolution Plan, or Resiliency Plan rather, or those two things? And are there more opportunities for the community to kind of get involved and discuss these really, really important changes in our downtown world?
Great. Well, Bob, thank you for your question. I think me, since my line of work is community relations, I'm always excited to hear people who are excited about that and who are interested in discussing in greater detail. To answer the second question first, yeah, the shoreline extension is sort of broadly the shorthand for the FIDI Seaport Climate Resilience Master Plan, which we also sometimes just call FIDI Seaport to abbreviate it. But yeah, so that all refers to the same thing. The study project that we're doing with Arcadis between Whitehall and Whitehall Terminal and the Brooklyn Bridge. So it's a great question regarding community engagement. The sort of order of operations, because there's a lot of folks to talk to that we've been working on in regard to community engagement, is sort of at each phase of the project, of which there are that we've sort of roughly divided into, speaking with the regulators, speaking with the Climate Coalition, and then speaking with the public, and sort of doing that in a sort of evolving way. We've also committed, as of the March 2019 announcement, to briefing altogether the elected officials and community boards 1 and 3 who are in the project area quarterly. So we're doing that as well with elected officials and staff, as well as community board staff and leadership. And then we've committed to do an update this update for community board 1 once a quarter as well. So unfortunately, because of the way that the worked out with the COVID pause, we had planned a climate coalition meeting in April, which was to have been followed with a public meeting in May or June. Overall, the contract has, I believe, 4 or 5 large public meetings, of which we will be doing the second in January. In early next year. So, Bob, to your point, unfortunately, the timing sort of it was bad timing in terms of when we were forced to pause the project, and now we're getting back up to speed. But we do intend on continuing to do the same amount of work before the end of this administration. So that said, we probably are going to do at least 3 large public meetings next year, in addition to all of those additional touch points. And then, last but not least, we're recognizing that the in-person and other traditional forms of engagement are not viable right now and may not be viable for some time. We're also going to be rolling out a new website in the next month, which, like I mentioned before, it's really important to us that it's not just a one-way flow of information, us to the public, but rather that there are clear and transparent opportunities for the public to leave comments there, for there to be an exchange of questions and answers with the engineering team, and for individual members of the public to see what other members of the public are thinking. So we should be rolling that website out in the next month, and then probably we'll have 3 large public meetings in addition to the one that we talked about for early next year. We'll have 3 of those at least throughout the course of 2021. And I think we would love to continue to hear any feedback in terms of ways that we could be reaching more or different audiences, et cetera.
Hey, Bob, before you go with your follow-up, let me just get to Wendy first. If you have another one, we'll come back to you, okay?
I just want to make a statement here, and that is that these large public meetings this is one of the most impactful things that's going to happen downtown into the next decades. And so I think that we need a lot more input. The number of ways in which this is going to influence everyone's lives down here is unimaginable, and also the amount of the city is really changing a lot, and we're really not sure of what kind of city we're going to have. So which direction this goes in is a really, really important lots of really important issues are raised, and a few meetings kind of coming up will just get bulldozed under that. And I don't think that's really enough or even close to fair. So that's my comment.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bob. We'll take that into account, and I think we're continuing to look for ways to be as inclusive as possible. There's something that we're working on right now, just to note really quickly, that I mentioned earlier, which is, there's always so much information. We always have how can we possibly in one meeting, to your point, give an update on the transportation part, the maritime ecology part, the environment part, the climate part, the open space part. So over the next, I think, 3 or 4 months, we are working on an idea right now to break those down into some smaller bite-sized workshops. So to have one topic specifically talking about what could this, what is this project looking at in regard to maritime ecology or historic preservation, for example. So we are, understanding that, like you said, the scope of this project is quite large and talks about a number of different subject areas. We are looking for ways, in addition to those larger meetings that I discussed, which are sort of opportunities to get a holistic update and ask any number of questions. We are looking for ways to sort of separate those subject areas out so that people can get more involved and give input where they're most interested or curious.
I just wanted to say that.
Wendy, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to, and thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to see how closely you're working. We're going to have a meeting later on this month with Rebuild by Design. And I keep coming back to my dream project, which I know is a far thing out there, especially with the financial crisis, but it was always going to be a public-private partnership plus pool, which has built so many great relationships with water keepers and river keepers and, all the other nonprofits. And, they certainly have worked closely with, their projects in terms of river quality and their great education outreach. But how much are you partnering with the Rebuild by Design folks and the plus pool folks and there's a lot of other nonprofits out there that are, talk about community engagement. That's really what they do all the time.
Right. So I might tag in Jordan here as well. Hi, Wendy. It's nice to hear from you. So yeah, it's a great point, and I can actually I might defer to Jordan in regard to the Rebuild by Design part on the plus pool piece. And Diana recently asked me for an update on this, which I have not yet provided to her, admittedly. So I owe you all that. Wendy, I think it's really important. We hear a clear cry from Community Ward 1 as well as others throughout the city for, where we can provide additional green space, additional open space, additional community space, et cetera. I think, I do want to emphasize that at the core of this project is, to Bob's point, how can we implement resiliency infrastructure to protect this neighborhood in a way that is implementable quickly, diligently, but, in the relatively near short to medium term. So I think with that at its heart, I do think that the discussions of recreation and what other possible public benefits we could see as part of it, water cleanliness and drainage, et cetera, we are definitely looking at all of that in terms of having consultants on board to do the, surveys of the urban design kind of work, of the recreation benefits kind of work. But I do think that we are going to be getting more into that, Wendy, as we get into next spring, because the core of the work right now is focused on that resilience piece. But definitely want to keep that conversation going and appreciate you chiming in on that. Jordan, would you like to speak really quickly as to how we?
Yeah, and are you going to participate in the Rebuild by Design meeting that's coming up later on this month?
Yeah, so I can take both of those. So yes, Janie Bavishi, our director, is joining for that conversation. My understanding is kind of an overview, some of the information we're talking about tonight, but very clearly giving the citywide perspective as well. So yeah, we're part of the conversation, and generally, we stay very tight with Rebuild by Design. There are kind of fewer advocates in this space than you would imagine. Kind of in the sustainability world, there's certainly a lot of organizations in the resiliency space. There aren't as many. They were, very instrumental in helping to pass the Restore Mother Nature Bond Act. I imagine a number of you are familiar with that. Unfortunately, because of the state's budget issues, was pulled off the ballot, and so we're not going to be able to vote on. But very clearly, a very instrumental organization in rallying folks towards funding a number of these projects, because we know that the need doesn't stop here. That truly this is a crisis that is citywide, statewide, something that we have to face across the country. Yes.
I see no new questions from CB1. I see one question from the general public. Bob, you want one more shot?
Well, I'm happy with what I said. I think I'm interested whether you're interested in more interaction with these agencies, because if you could you even name another project that has so much influence over downtown as this one? It's really a very, very major thing. And at a point where the city really doesn't have money, it's really a sacrifice. And this requires even methodologies for extremely tough choices about how we're going to spend money and how we're going to finance, as a large city, just really major projects. So, I'm just the infrastructure problems we have without COVID, that we have without resiliency, are tremendous. But add to that the tremendous challenges of storm surge and these kinds of projects, you just kind of go, wow, don't you want a piece of the action of kind of helping to direct those, or being able to draw the public in to at least not be unconscious as these things go on?
Are you asking me?
Yes, I'm asking you.
Oh yeah, I'm furious about it. I think the extension project is, well, my personal opinions I'm not going to air right now. I think I'm very concerned about how that's going to be zoned, as I mentioned earlier. I'm concerned about who's interested in it and who wants to spend money on developing it. That's a huge concern to me. I think everyone on this call knows that I've personally developed over 3 gigawatts of renewable energy. I'm obviously committed to the cause, but I have real concerns about how this is going to be developed. I have real concerns about Governor's Island. And I think these are 2 massive projects that we have to keep an eye on. I'm just trying to move the meeting forward so we don't approach 9 o'clock.
All I'm saying, and I want your agreement on, is that 1 or 2 meetings that are kind of big, gigantic public meetings aren't enough to even get into a feel of direction. And that in the same way that you and I feel strongly about this, I'll bet you that people wouldn't be on resiliency committees if they didn't care about this, and that everyone cares and wants a say, and we want others to have a say. And the kind of nice thing called the community open house really isn't a learning or really input kind of opportunity from my point of view at all, because nothing ever changes.
Yep, I agree with you.
With that, I rest my question and my position on this.
Yeah, Bob, you and I are in alignment. Again, as acting chair for the evening, I'm just trying to move the meeting along. I personally, removing myself from the acting chair role, I think there should be special committees for both Governor's Island and the extension, and that we should just focus on those issues alone, including a special committee on removing major roadways, which is a concern of mine as well. But again, my concern is not letting a meeting go late into the night at this point.
And then moving this back really quick. Moving it back over to Will, you can see that we really care about this stuff, and that really there's a tremendous stakeholdership involved in this. And if we fail to have a voice in this, what are we here for? And so, from my point of view, this is an existential question, because everyone's life is on the line with COVID everywhere, every day anyway.
Nothing you said.
Absolutely. And I think, I do want to, there are, with the sort of various commitments to meetings that we've had, I think, there are dozens and dozens of conversations that go well beyond the 3 large public meetings. And I think at that public open house that we had before with the 300 attendees and all of that, there was an opportunity to get the, I think 20 members at least of the project team in the room. And, somebody from the public who wanted to talk about drainage infrastructure could spend that time and, talk to that. engineering consultant for 30 or 40 minutes and leave a lot of feedback behind. But Bob, I totally hear you. I mean, I think it is hard for all of us, frankly, to grasp the size of this. And I think, any recommendations along the way as to how how we could best interface with the community board, I think, and the broader public is really important to us. I do want to also highlight that the Climate Coalition group is co-chaired by Tammy Meltzer. Alice and Wendy, as well as Patrick Cannell, are all members of that group. We also have, I think Michael Kramer is here tonight. Michael Kramer is in that group. So, there are sort of multiple touch points and multiple levels of stakeholder engagement here. And I think it's really key. And I do also want to be clear, during the arc of this project, we are going to be proposing a project and an implementable first phase project by the end of this administration, but we're also not going through environmental review, nor are we going through et cetera. So, this is really sort of the ideas and the brainstorming and the big ideas phase. We do want something that's implementable and doesn't just go on the shelf like another report, because we do need to obviously implement this urgently. But, in addition to the work that we're doing now, there are obviously all of the formal procedures in place that we would all expect from a large land use project. So let's keep that conversation going, and I appreciate that. Obviously, it's always good to hear that people want to be more engaged with these projects.
Hey, Will, just one personal note for me. I would love to be involved. That's a lot of echo. I would love to be involved with that climate committee. I worked in renewable energy. I'm also on Vice President Biden's policy committee for energy. So I would love to serve if you would have me.
Great, yeah, let's have a conversation.
Yep. Okay, Jocelyn, you've been waiting patiently. Go ahead. Diana, she's on the phone. If you're going to mute her.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was from much earlier when Will was asking if Elijah or I would jump in for the presentation.
Oh, okay.
And I was on mute, so thank you.
Hey, Jocelyn.
Hello. Hello,
Okay,
everyone.
so hearing no other questions from the public or for the board, are we ready to move on? Great, thank you. Will, this has been comprehensive, informative. I really appreciate you being as transparent, especially with my hard question as you've been. We expect ongoing engagement, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have next.
Great, let's talk soon. Thanks so much, everybody. Nice to see everyone.
Thank
you. Take care of yourselves. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, finally on the agenda, we have Dinah. I think you're going to have to lead this one, but we have capital and expense budget items for FY22. Dinah, did you just want to entertain some thoughts on this without getting too far down a rabbit hole, or what?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This kind of culminates at the end of this month at the executive committee meeting, and then the full board meeting. This is our annual discussion and voting on capital and expense budget priorities. It's been on all the committee agendas for the last 2 months. Maybe 2 weeks ago, I sent the committee a special email resending what Lucian sent in August. There's a dedicated community board webpage with a bunch of information on this process, but the next step, or if Alice were here, the next step would be to discuss any new ideas or change in what was there. And, Alice kind of takes that under consideration and brings it to the executive committee. So if anybody has any particular ideas now that they want to discuss, I'm happy to hear them and pass them along to Alice. Otherwise, I think everybody should feel free to email their thoughts to Alice, and we can, have that discussion at executive committee this month.
Look at that. I see no hand. Bob, your hand is still up. Did you want to talk about this, or was it just still up? You're muted.
I just wanted to mention one thing that's been important to me for a while, and that is we are CB1, and our border goes all the way to the end of up to Canal Street from Stuyvesant High School. And so that isn't where the cities need to protect things ends. So I would like to encourage that we stand behind building something from Stuyvesant High School north and then trying to find ways to interest the city in protecting whatever needs protection along the west side of the island, because, you know, just to stop at North Moore Street really isn't far enough, even if there are administrative constraints that kind of lead us in that direction. So I would like to add at least some budget item that looks at least reaching our own border at Canal Street, even though that isn't where we should stop our interest, but we are responsible for that. And we should really see that through in terms of resiliency. So I would like to add that as an item to the capital budget list.
That's great. I think that's a matter of putting a little more detail into what we already have. I know for years we've had both short-term and long-term requests for capital funding for resiliency projects. So if it doesn't already stipulate that comprehensive component, I think that's something great to consider adding.
I agree with that, and I would emphasize, or at least mention in it, a point that Bob alluded to, that for it to be meaningful, it needs to link up with protections north of Canal Street, since Canal is itself kind of in a valley, so it won't do any good to end right there, but presumably people above us want to have a project, and we should link up with that.
Great.
Right, and I'm sure you know we can put that into the context of that, you know, that we lost the Army Corps of Engineer project. So that's the thing that has to be with the detail that you know better than anyone, Diana, in terms of all those points are good, but the big other point is without the Army Corps of Engineer, which was supposed to handle everything north of Stuyvesant, you know, it's certainly a city and a state issue, but it's also a federal issue. So, you know, that's at least where the direction was supposed to be coming from, the tri-state study that was taking place. So I don't know if in your notes you can reference that we lost that tri-state study.
Yep.
And that we need to have something more specific that's just state-led to protect temporarily with, you know, HESCO barriers or whatever it is in Hudson River Park, which will be ugly, but we need something or whatever it's going to be. And of course, what Bob's alluding to, which is the long-term real protection on the whole west side.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
All right.
I just have one question about the process. I've always been interested in looking at all the wonderful design that's happening in Battery Park City and what the BPCA has worked on. I'm really interested in whether or not it's appropriate to think about simplified barrier designs that can be executed very inexpensively and kind of built in these kinds of things. Can we suggest that there be an investment in design and engineering of simplified barriers that can kind of be built out in our own community and also used in other places across the city, and they be a real interest of simplification, a real focus of both simplification and economics, so that they can be easily implemented and cheaply built, but are very highly effective and just fit the needs that we have in Lower Manhattan and meet Wendy's requirement that they're all manufactured in New York.
Bob, are you talking about short-term protection?
No, I'm talking about the kinds of barriers. There's one kind of barrier that was in the Battery Park City project that was going to go north along the West Side Highway there, and that had some little sections, and I could see those same little sections being applied possibly in Wagner Park, for example. But then you could actually use them instead of something bigger along the Battery Park itself, rather than kind of take out all those bike paths and things, to actually simplify that with just a line of these kinds of barriers that can kind of move up and down, but that would be easily implementable for us and anywhere you needed them. And so they would be HESCO barriers are of a certain height. This is in the range of between where HESCO ends and say 12 feet, or maybe even higher. It depends on what is possible in the engineering.
Well, as Bob knows, I've mentioned many times that this is if anyone has it's a growth industry. If companies can come up with flip up barriers and all these other things, it shouldn't just be the Dutch that are known for their barriers. We could figure it out too. We have so many great engineering schools in the state of New York. And Bob, I gave up you gave up on New York, but said in at least in the tri-state region versus Texas.
Well, I'm not giving up on New York, and if there's ever a time we need some industry, it's going to be coming up.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean I give up on New York. It's a bad quote, but to say they need to. So what Gwen Dawson and other people said about buying flip-up barriers that will be permanent is that they also need to, in order to contract with the city, they need to have a record of a past success. That's why it's so hard for the city to contract with startups. So if we put in there something like the city and state could build up these engineering designs and taking some risks and chances with startup entities for this. The hardest part is that they have to contract with these big companies that have a proven track record, and this is we're in new territory here, to your point, Bob.
Well, I think it's important to I think that this should become an innovative city and innovative society again. So the impetus is always toward new design, new engineering, new discoveries, and then making all that work.
I mean, to some extent, this is the discussion we'll have on the EIS now that there's going to be an EIS on the Battery Park City things, because that's fundamentally an alternatives analysis is a key component of that.
So the only reason I mentioned this is to see whether or not Diana thought this was an appropriate kind and style of project for fitting onto that list.
Well, it depends. If I think there's a renewed focus on self-reliance for the city and the state. We've seen a lot of that with various manufacturing throughout COVID. It depends on how it's worded. If the board is open to supporting, as an expense, a study of certain things, or capital funding for resiliency is so tight. We need a lot of capital money for infrastructure, but if it's worded in a way, to support that as an industry in New York City or as a specific type of infrastructure, we can incorporate it into a request that we already have, or create a new one. I can't tell you definitively. That's not at my discretion, but I'll include it in my notes to Alice for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
With that, and hopefully with no other questions, I was proud to serve as your temporary chair tonight. I hope it was efficient. I hope I was efficient. I hope I got you all back to your families tonight. These are all important issues that I'm extremely interested in, and I would encourage the actual chairs to, and hopefully the chair of the board, Tammy, to commission, as I said to Bob, special groups to keep an eye on both the Resiliency Project and Governor's Island, two issues that I think are very important to us. But with that, I'd like to adjourn.
Sounds good. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.